disability itself is a tricky concept and a tricky word because disability is, I think, fundamentally social. I think, we need to move away from the idea that it's really about, one person's differences being problematic for everybody else. Disability comes about from lack of accommodation.
Welcome to Some Stutter Law, a podcast by the Communication Collaborative. Some Stutter Law is Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast about living with communication disorders. We speak directly to people living with speech and language disorders and others such as speech-language pathologists, researchers, educators, family members, and allies. We use inclusive language and themes to help rebuild confidence and hope by dismantling myths, stigmas, stereotypes, and barriers. My name is Greg O'Grady, and I'm a person who stutters and host of Some Stutter Law. Some Stutter Law mission is dismantling and rebuilding communication disorders. Let's start listening. Some Stutter Law mandate is in the spirit of Newfoundland and Labrador's humor, robust and frank interactive discussions. Some Stutter Law podcast aims to rebuild confidence and hope for people who live with communication disorders by dismantling myths, stigmas, stereotypes, and barriers. Some Stutter Law podcast objectives are raising awareness, education, understanding, and acceptance of communication disorders by providing support, current information, research, and resources. Raising awareness that communication disorders can impact a person's life emotionally, educationally, physically, socially, and vocationally. Creating a safe space where guests can be themselves without fear of being judged. Today, Some Stutter Law welcomes Jesse Harris. Jesse is an associate professor of linguistics at the University of California, Los Angeles. His academic research focuses on how adults perceive and interpret language in moment-by-moment comprehension. He is a person who stutters and serves on the board of the Stuttering Scholarship Alliance, a not-for-profit dedicated to facilitating access to high-quality, client-centered speech therapy to people in underserved communities, as well as providing resources on disability rights for students who stutter and education for speech-language pathologists in training. So, welcome to Jesse to some Stutter Law.
Thank you, Craig. It's really wonderful to be here.
Good. Jesse, in your bio, you mentioned at the beginning that your research focuses on how adults perceive and interpret language in moment-by-moment comprehension. Would you be able to to elaborate a little about this?
Sure. Yeah. So I work in an area of linguistics called psycholinguistics, and that is a very kind of broad term. It encompasses a lot of different areas. In general, we're interested in how the language system might be embedded into a larger cognitive system, basically the mind or the brain. So you can study lots of things as a psycholinguist. You can study how infants acquire language. You can study how people learn a language later on in life. You can study production, right? All the mechanisms that go into articulating and executing speech. And I in particular work on language processing research from typically from a comprehension side. And what that means is that we want to know how people are able to decode speech with such rapid speed and with such fidelity. So, in essence, it's what you're doing right now when you're hearing my speech, and what the listeners are doing right now as they're hearing us talk. And to me, it seems like magic. Somehow we're taking this speech stream, which doesn't have any structure, right? It's totally linear, and we're giving it an interpretation, and we're giving it meaning, and we're putting it into a context. And so, um, I guess my main interest is, how is it that human beings are you know built to be able to do this incredibly hard task, and for the most part have it perceptually feel so easy.
Okay, Jesse. Jesse, how did you get involved in linguistics?
That's interesting. So as a person who stutters, I was thinking about language a lot, growing up, always. And I found myself sort of wondering about this dichotomy, or this split that I felt between my knowledge of language. I felt like I had this sort of totally intact understanding. I knew the grammar, I understood what words meant, and yet when it came to produce speech, obviously I was going to struggle in some pretty major ways, and I just found myself sort of thinking about that issue, what that meant. And then I was fortunate, in high school I came across uh, a documentary about Noam Chomsky, and it was the Manufacturing Consent um, documentary. And while I was very interested in all the content, the part that interested me the most is the discussion of his theoretical work on syntax. And he talks about universal grammar. And universal grammar is the idea that all human beings are endowed with this sort of innate, um, tacit or implicit knowledge of their language. And so that makes this really interesting split between competence, being like what I know as a native speaker, and performance, how I execute that knowledge in a given context. And so for me, it was in high school, and it felt like a light bulb just went off, and I thought, wow, people actually study this thing that I've been thinking about. And so yeah, it just kind of was off to the races. And I was very fortunate in high school in that we had a family friend who was a linguist, Fritz Neumeyer at the University of Washington, and he was extremely generous. He kind of sent me articles to read, and would meet with me, and kind of helped me think through some of the literature. And so I
Mm,
was very fortunate in that way to be encouraged. Um, and
mm,
so, yeah, I think it's sort of this natural outgrowth of thinking about speech a lot, kind of all of the time, and then um, having a way of studying it that for me felt like it connected me more with um, kind of the rest of humanity, right? So the idea of universal grammar is that it's sort of shared throughout everybody, and it's just different languages realize that grammar in different ways. And I just found that
mm,
really appealing. I think, as you know, people who stutter can feel very alienated and isolated. And I think for me, having that kind of like universal, at least, the philosophy of having a universal connection, uh, I think kind of connected me with the kind of notion that there's a way in which people who stutter are really just like everybody else. So I think
mm,
that's kind of what drew me into it in general.
mm. Jesse, have you have you included stuttering and communication disorders in your research? Have you done much research?
I have not, and that might be surprising. And I've thought a little bit about why that is. I don't have a good answer because I find it extremely interesting. Um, I mean, some of it is that there's just a little bit of an ease factor. So for me, studying comprehension was just going to be an easier route into getting into the more abstract things about the mind that I think I was interested in. But I also, just to be honest, think there was some aversion too, sort of
Mm.
aversion. So sometimes in academia there can be a little bit of bias against what can be called me search. Like heading things that like
Okay.
reflect your own um, I don't know, like your own experience in the world. And it's taken me a while to realize that no, I think research is actually very important, and that's where a lot of insights come from. There are a lot of really amazing people who stutter who are doing research on stuttering. So I
Hmm.
think to
Hmm.
me there was a bit of baked in stigma about being a person who stutters who studies stuttering. And
Hmm.
uh, I've been fortunate, and I actually stayed away from the stuttering community for a long time. It's only just in the last few years have I become involved, and it's
Hmm.
been a great experience. And so I think
Okay.
that I hope that moving forward, it will involve more um, research on stuttering, both the
Okay.
mechanics and the like social and emotional impact on people's lives.
Hmm. So, Jesse, I'm not too sure if I'm going to phrase this question right, but as as a, as a linguistics, linguistics professor, like how do you translate the actually the ultimate goal to a like a layperson, much like you know myself, the overall purpose of linguistics. No,
Yeah,
no, this actually may be a $64 question, but I don't know.
it's a tough one. I mean, so I think that linguists there's a challenge of problematizing our field, and part of that is that for many people, speech is not something they have to think about. People who stutter are going to be different, right? Or people who um, have dyslexia might be different, right? If you have some kind of um, disability or challenge with speech, you're going to be thinking about speech and you know a lot more often. But for most people, speech it's very natural, right?
Hmm.
And what the challenge is that it's actually this exceptional ability that human beings have in a way that other animals do not, right? I mean, there's rich communication systems among a lot of other different animal types, but human beings seem to be special when it comes to the complexity of language.
Hmm.
And so I think in kind of a fundamental sense, the study of language is the study of a very important fundamental part of being human. And so what we tend to do is think about how is it that we come to learn the things that we know, that we take for granted. And is that through learning and exposure, right? Our parents don't know enough about language to be able to teach us really, right? So somehow we're able to extract this really rich knowledge from not a lot of exposure to speech. And the big question is, how could that be, right? And so there are lots of different answers, and one is that we're sort of endowed with a very special ability. Um, and so we, I think, as linguists, by and large, want to understand how the ways in which language is the same across different communities of, of speakers, and the ways in which it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't
Mm.
know if that answers the question. It's a basic one, and I mean, in a good way, right? It gets at the kind of
Oh, good. Okay, that
fundamental
is
question of,
okay.
why would you do this thing?
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah.
So, okay, Jesse, would genetics and linguistics partner with each other, overlap? And if so, could you explain that?
Oh, that's a great question. And I wish I knew more about it, but I can say a little bit about what I know. So, yeah, the idea is that um, our ability to learn language the way that we do, to be able to speak and decode language, is genetic in a large way, and you see that in populations where there has been a disruption to some extent, right? So, a lot of the research that's coming out on stuttering, it's very clear that there's a strong genetic component to stuttering. And so, I think in general, looking at populations that have particular expressions of genes is really important, and it's something that um, I think we're just getting a handle on now, or just starting to get a handle on now.
Mm,
So yeah, I think it's a really interesting overlap. That's a
mm-hmm.
fantastic question. And
Is linguistics a popular field for students to go into? Because you're a professor at University of California. Is there like a strong interest or increase?
yeah, I think in general, linguistics tends to be a smaller field. Most people don't know what linguistics is before entering college, and you can go through college and university without ever taking a linguistics class. So it's definitely more boutique in that sense. UCLA is a little bit different in that we have maybe the largest major in the country, or if not the world. It's very, very popular major, uh, considering its relative size. So
Mm,
what I think is maybe nice about our program is that we have a lot of different sub majors. So there's the general linguistics. There's part of the program that I'm involved in is called linguistics and psychology. We have linguistics and computation, and then lots
mm,
of other sort of sub areas that students can specialize in. And
mm,
it's I think people are drawn to our major for a variety of reasons, but one is that the skills are transferable. Linguistics is really sort of about problem solving, and the domain just sort of in some ways just happens to be about language. So linguists are, you know, we're sort of a nerdy bunch, and we like patterns, and we
oh,
like problems and arguments. And so a lot of our classes are focused on how to hone, how to cultivate those from more general critical reasoning skills, along with some sort of technical skills that can transfer over to
mm,
other fields.
mm. So you mentioned, Jesse, that there's there's sub degrees or groups within linguistics. So where would students, well, what career paths would these students take once they graduate? Then.
That's a great question. So yeah, there are a lot of different career paths that our students take. Some become speech language pathologists, particularly
Okay.
in the linguistics and psychology major. So they will learn lots about kind of speech production mechanisms and about speech in general. Um, uh, we have students who, a lot of our students will go into the tech field, because there's a lot of demand for the skills that we provide in general, but also for like speech to text or text to speech. where a lot of systems need linguists on staff to be able to create and code systems that are able to deal with kind of speech is noisy, right? We tend to think of it as being very linear, but there's a lot of overlap in 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 speech, and so it's very helpful to have linguists working on a team. And then some of my students have gone on to do, like administrative work or working in education. A number of our students go on into academia, and so yeah, it's you can kind of take a very specific route, like think of it as kind of a vocational component, but it also allows you to do to engage in other kinds of interests that you might have too.
Mm, okay. So, similar to the crossover between linguistics and genetics, is there crossover between mental health and linguistics?
It's a fantastic question. Not to my knowledge.
Okay,
So
okay.
I have. I mean, the closest thing I've seen is in some of the artificial intelligence work that I've looked at or conferences that I've been at. There are some applications for like detecting um, speech patterns of people who may be in crisis. Um,
Mm,
there is some really interesting work on schizophrenia and speech. It seems like there are certain kinds of speech patterns that are displayed more by people with schizophrenia. Um, but no, I don't think there's to my knowledge, and this might be just my ignorance. I don't know of a lot of overlap.
okay.
That's
Curious, Jesse. Curious.
uh,
No,
maybe there should
no,
be.
no. So, Jesse, would you like to share a little bit about your history as a person who stutters?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been a lifelong member of the Stuttering Club. I don't remember a time when I didn't stutter. And yeah, I some of my earliest memories at around 4 or 5 are with speech therapists. And yeah, I was very fortunate. My parents are psychotherapists, and my mom had done some
Mm,
shadowing in her graduate training of an SLP. And so when I was diagnosed, she was, um, very much on top of things, and I went to speech therapy, which was sort of helpful and sort of not. I'm not sure. Yeah, and um, the stuttering has definitely, as it's going to influence, I think, every corner of my life. It shaped the person that I am. My interests, my fears and my anxieties about speech, obviously are going to come from having difficulty at various points. But I think that stuttering has also provided me with some gifts too, some opportunities to learn about myself and who I am, and meet great people like you and others who stutter, who have been a huge inspiration. Um, and it's given me a career too in a lot of ways. And so I sort of have struggled a lot with how I feel about being a person who stutters, as you're going to do, right, at some point. And I think for me, it's okay that there's, um, I don't know. I feel that for me, at least in recent years, my position has evolved a lot from being someone who was more covert. There's a lot of
mm,
word switching. It was exhausting. I felt like I was running down a maze and trying to make the switches as fast as I can, so no one could tell I was stuttering. And the last couple of years have changed. I've allowed myself to stutter more
mm,
openly, especially in my classes, because I think it's sort of an important thing to let people see you stutter and not be ashamed of it, not be afraid of it
Mm.
as much.
Jesse, like what is the reaction, or if there's a reaction when when you self-disclose to your students? I mean, does your students ask any questions, or is there any dialogue? Or?
I don't always self-disclose because I feel like it's
Okay,
obvious, and
okay.
there's there are situations where I do self-disclose because it makes it easier on me. Um, I don't self-disclose usually in my class. I might make a comment about it, but for example, at the beginning of class, I don't say I'm a person who stutters, and you're going to hear me stutter sometimes, and that's okay. I know people who do that, and I think it's a very effective um, tool. But for me, I want to make it clear that I'm not apologizing for having a stutter, and that it's part stuttering is part of the normal continuum of speech.
Mm,
I don't feel like I have to make myself as an exception. So that's where I've landed as a professor who stutters, and I think that might
mm,
change. I think that um, I have self-disclosed in the past, and it hasn't usually generated comments. I think people are okay with it, and
mm,
if they're not, then that's sort of up to them.
mm,
I certainly have gotten feedback and comments. People don't. I think it was harder when I was more covert because I would try to hide it, and there was a lot of fillers, and sometimes you end up with syntax when you try to substitute words, end up with syntax that
mhm.
doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't say what you mean. It doesn't convey it.
You actually lose the meaning completely.
Yeah, and
You
it does the exact opposite of what we
do.
want it to do. And so I just I think it was harder when I was more covert in that way.
Hmm. Okay. Jesse, let's circle back for a bit. You mentioned that sometimes when a person self discloses, like, I'm a person who stutters. My name is Greg O'Grady. I'm a person who stutters. So I mean, does this mean that one may be apologizing? That's an interesting topic because I've never thought of that before. That my name is Greg O'Grady. I'm a person who stutters, and you're right. In one sense, it can come across as being apologetic for who you are, and it's just it actually may feed into one's low self worth, one's embarrassment and shame. You know, yeah. Your thoughts, Jesse? Would
Yeah,
you mind elaborating on that?
sure. I want to make it clear that I don't think there's a one size fits all prescription here. I think that I do self disclose in certain circumstances where I find that it'll be helpful for me. Um, and I don't think it has to be construed as an apology. I think there can be something very affirming about it, right? So I'm Jesse, I'm a person who stutters, and it can be helpful for your conversational partner who might not understand or know what's going on. It's just a personal thing that I came to
Hmm.
as a professor in particular, um, and it's something that I kind of address as needed. But there's a way I
Hmm.
would think it relates to. I have some vague thoughts on this, and I hope I can share them and not be sort of taken too seriously. But about the labor of disability. So, being covert the reason why I've stopped being covert is mainly because I saw people who I met people who stutter, and I liked how they sounded, and I thought that they showed me that you can stutter well, and that was really like kind of a freeing concept for me, that stuttering doesn't mean not communicating. It just means communicating in a different way. Um, but there's a social burden of stuttering, as I'm sure you have experienced, and there is so much emotional labor that I think we do as people who stutter to make people who don't stutter feel comfortable with our disability or with the way we speak. It doesn't have to be a disability. This is just the way that I speak. And it only becomes the different only becomes a disability when there's some kind of when there's like lack of accommodation, right? Lack of understanding. And so I found that I was spending so much time trying to make other people comfortable about how I speak. And I've become less interested in that as I've gotten older. I don't think the burden of stuttering should fall entirely on me. I think it's a social act that arises between more than one person. Might be something that I'm doing in my speech, but it arises from a conversation. It arises from an interaction. So I
Mm,
don't feel like, for me at least, as a person who stutters, I don't always want to assume that emotional toll.
mhm. So if if I understand you correctly, Jesse, is that you know like are you saying that if like you know being a covert person who stutters, you know we're trying to or attempting to to make our listeners feel comfortable. Is this what you're saying, or is
Well,
this one one interpretation of
yeah,
a covert stutter?
I think it's a fair interpretation. It's it represents my own experience, and I'm not claiming to analyze or categorize anyone else's experience. I'll just say that when I try to hide my speech, I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for someone else,
Hmm.
and I that gets old.
it,
And it's
it is old.
old,
It,
and there's
it,
so much
it,
mental gymnastics that go into it, and
yeah.
I found that at the end of the day, I never thought I'd be in a position where I speak so much, and
Hmm.
I found myself being exhausted at the end of the day, just
Hmm.
wiped out. And I think a lot of that was because all of the anxiety and the physical pressure to speak in a certain way, and it's been very
Hmm.
freeing to just stutter openly more.
Just stutter openly.
And that's not true
Definitely.
always. I mean, I there was
Yeah.
I was thinking about this just the other day, where I was in a store wanting to return something I didn't want, and there's the anticipation of waiting in line and then having to talk to a cashier, and I just almost just walked away, thinking like I don't want to do this. I don't want to go through this process. And so there are certain times in which I think I will definitely allow myself to be covert and to switch, and you know um,
Hmm.
so I guess what I'm just trying to say is that I'm not trying to like give advice to or say that you should not be covert in all circumstances, or however you feel comfortable. I'm talking about my own experience.
Hmm. Jesse, like I'm starting to think more and more, you know, when I think about, a person who is a covert, stutterer, which, which I have, which I have a history about being a covert stutterer because I used to, try as best I could to to hide my stuttering. But someone brought to my attention, as and speech language pathologist, and she she used the analogy of a beach ball
Mhm.
trying to push a beach ball underneath the water,
Yeah.
and how much energy and stress that takes just to get this ball under the water, which is impossible. So that's a great analogy for a covert person who stutters. So it's a choice that we as covert stutters has to make. And but I think we haven't made this decision for honest reasons.
Uh, that is a perfect analogy, to the sort of experience of trying to um, of covert stuttering, right?
Yeah.
I love that, and there's sort of an element of pushing something down, which definitely resonates with me a lot. Sort of,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that it doesn't allow us to connect with the experience of stuttering, which in my mind isn't of itself. It's not a painful experience. Stuttering can be annoying. It can be, there's like the tightness in the throat sometimes, and the mechanics of it can be, discouraging and painful. But the painful part is the social aspect. And, so for me, kind of divorcing the mechanics of stuttering for myself, it's like it's a word repetition, it's the sound repetition. I'm blocking. That's There's nothing inherently bad about that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think connecting with that experience in a more neutral way has really changed my own relationship with tuttering and how open I'm willing to be um, with it.
Mm-hmm. Jesse, I would like your thoughts on the F word, which is the fluency word. Because I often ask my guests this question: how what's your thoughts about the F word, the fluency? Is it a good word or a bad word?
I don't know what it means. I don't know what
Mm,
fluency means, right? So it's a benchmark that gets imposed, and I don't know how helpful it really is. I mean, so the way I've been thinking about speech and stuttering lately is really more of a bell curve. So there's some people who have this exceptional, you know, ability to speak. Some portion of the population just through talent or hard work are excellent. Some of us struggle more, right? And then there's sort of a big healthy middle. But for me, it's all part of the same curve. So that's, I think, something that I've learned as a linguist, and that I might have my speech rate might be different. I might have more word repetitions or phonemic repetitions or blocks, but it's all part of a continuum. And so I don't really know what fluency actually means. I think it's
mm, mm,
fluency for who you are, and I think it's more helpful to think of how do you feel about your speech in a particular circumstance. I think that circles back to the why am I trying to present my speech in a way that doesn't reflect me? It doesn't reflect who I am. I'm doing it for someone else. So when that benchmark of fluency gets imposed by someone else, it sets up this impossible target. And I think that's a real, for me, that's a real problem. So
mm,
I don't know. But I say that, and sure, I think some days I'm more fluent than others. Today I feel very fluent. Other days I'm not, and Um, I can't deny that I would wish more fluent days on myself than not, but
Mm,
as kind of a target to shoot for, it feels like it's more of a gift when it happens than something that I'm trying to manifest.
mm. So Jesse, as people stutter, we all know how fluid stuttering is. We have our good days and our train wreck days. I'm telling you. So when you have your periods of, I guess, train wreck days, how 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 do you self care for yourself as a person who stutters, or just get yourself back into a mindset, a healthier mindset?
Oh, that's another great question, Greg. It's a tough one. I wish I did it better. I think a lot of people who stutter can be very hard on themselves for having um, difficult days. Um, so that's the time when I think self-disclosure does really help me. And it's been met in different ways by different people. Sometimes just saying I'm having a difficult speech day helps me, and it doesn't always, it's not always clear, I think, to other people what that means, because they don't have that experience and can't really necessarily imagine it. But I think for me, letting people know that it's a particularly challenging day releases me from my kind of self-imposed expectations that my speech has to sound a certain way.
Hmm.
Um, but it's hard, I think, in general, stuttering and self-care is such an important component of living with stuttering that can be overlooked. It can be humiliating and challenging, when I at least feel like people aren't taking me as seriously as I would like, or I'm being dismissed, and that's hard. That's very
Mm,
dehumanizing. And you know, we all have to deal with those circumstances and situations. Um, it's certainly not right, and so I do the
mhm,
best I can to just be who I am in that moment and feel the emotions that are coming up. And but I would be
mm,
lying if I said I didn't hate some of those, and pretty awful. Um, and so I allow myself to sometimes avoid them. And I don't know if that's healthy or if that's the ideal, but that's where I'm at. And if I'm routinely in situations with certain people where my speech is not being received kindly, then I minimize my amount of time with that person, and that's
mm,
okay.
mm. When when you're when you're in your meetings with your colleagues, Jess, the other professors, when there's a lot of conversation going on about various topics, items, whatever. I you see, used to get so overwhelmed listening to my colleagues, because you're right. There's a lot of very articulate people. The conversations are so quickly when I was sometimes when I'm trying to say a few words, my colleagues are off to on a different topic. How do you handle the frustration as a professor, or do you get frustrated?
I get frustrated. Yeah, I get you nailed it. It's I wish I had some insight here. It's definitely something that I'm working on for myself. Yeah, I have a lot of anxiety when it comes to kind of asserting myself into a conversation with a particular speed. And so I think, like a lot of people who stutter, I sort of have strategic ways of doing that. Yeah, I don't have a good answer. That's one that is very challenging. Um,
Mm,
the thing that I guess is that I try to remind myself that there's not really equal access to time. You know, there's this great This American Life segment with Jerome Ellis, who's a person who stutters, who is absolutely brilliant, and he has this performance where he really goes into the depth of temporal inequity, and that comes up a lot for me in talks as well. We have time limits. And I don't know if something I practice that's 20 minutes is going to be 20 minutes when I'm in front of 200 colleagues, you know? I don't know. So there's always this sort of element um, of I guess of risk and uncertainty, and just to know that that's the price of entry. Some of those
Mm,
feelings are what it costs to be involved in the world and to not shrink away from being an active member of wherever it is your whatever your community is at the time. And
mm,
you know, just people who stutter have a different price of access, and everyone has
mhm,
a difficulty of some kind, and this is our our cost, which
mhm,
feels high at
mhm,
times, but you know, it's a cost like any other to some extent if you abstract
mhm,
away.
mm. You mentioned earlier about disability. Do you feel that stuttering is a disability? What's your thoughts on that?
I think I don't know. It's one that I've struggled with. So you know, I mentioned I didn't join the stuttering community until relatively late, maybe even just a few years ago, and um, you know, I didn't think of it as a disability. I think I had my own stereotypes about what disability is and looks like, and um, there are some very positive things I think about identifying as a person with a disability. I think that it has allowed me to um, I'm not sure. It sort of allowed me to situate myself within a different kind of context, right? That this is just I experienced something that is challenging for me, and it's not my fault that I sound the way that I
Mm,
sound. But you know, disability itself is a tricky concept and a tricky word. Because disability is, I think, fundamentally social. I think, you know, we need to move away from the idea that it's really about, you know, one person's differences being problematic for everybody else. And this, I think, links back to the idea of um, being covert and the social burden of stuttering. Um, Disability comes about from lack of accommodation. I don't think I think it's a fundamentally relational term that really
mhm,
only gets realized through um, a lack of an appropriate environment for people of all kinds of all types, and that goes beyond
mhm,
people who stutter. Right? That's the I think I would you know want to see what other people with different disabilities think about that.
mm. You know, stuttering is a stuttering is a two-way relationship with people. It's the list. It's just the person who's trying to that stutters trying to say your words, and the the listeners. What what would what are your thoughts about how people who stutter should, I guess, work with with the listener, or vice versa as well? What's the listener's responsibility when listening to a person who stutters? Because stuttering is can be so, as I was saying, so fluid, and there's different types of stuttering. Well, what can we do as people who stutter to support or help listeners?
Oh, I want to ask you that question. That's such a challenging one, and I wish I knew. Um,
Yeah.
you know, that's something that I definitely struggle with. I sort of think of stuttering as a bit of a like the sorting hat in Harry Potter. it will allow me to get a sense of who's willing to work with me and who's not. And um, it's a very, I think, pointed experience in that you can tell pretty quickly on if someone is going to be receptive to stuttering and if they're not interested. And I feel like that's in and of itself a bit of a gift, right? So why
Mm-hmm.
waste time with someone who won't accept you for who you are? And if
Mm-hmm.
that comes out at the outset, then time saved. Right? Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's not
Okay.
that simple, and
No, I know.
it's complex. As we have to engage with people from all kinds of in all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
circumstances and situations, and going up to a counter and boarding a airplane, telling people where you're going and going through customs and all that stuff can be very stressful and can have real ramifications, and
Mm-hmm.
so there's kind of no one size fits all. I think we all have different feelings about how these relationships work, and so I guess maybe long story short, there are certain kinds of relationships that I'm willing to put in a lot of effort to help people understand what the experience is
Mm-hmm.
like and what they can do, and it's sort of you can only do so much. um, and then there are certain situations where they're short-lived and or maybe they're very constrained, and so they may not be necessary to spend a lot of time. There may just be a little bit of misunderstanding, and at the end of the day, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
How how
Okay.
how do you how do you talk to people about it? I would love to know. I don't
Yeah. Yeah.
good sense.
You see, I mean, this is an ongoing challenge as well for me because, you know, like we as people who stutter tend to read, we interpret, we allow facial expressions to control how we react. I mean, if I'm talking to somebody who presents as being very like impatient, have a frown, whatever. I allow that to 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 make my stuttering worse. Whereas that's my problem, you see. So yeah, this is one area. So I use it as an opportunity for learning. But you're right as well. There there are times because the conversations are so short lived. And if like if I feel that uncomfortable and I actually sort of end end the relationship as soon as I can. So there's no answer. You're right. I mean, one size doesn't fit all. However, though, if like if I have something important to say, I'll say it, and then no matter how much time it takes, you know what I mean. And so I feel it's the listener's responsibility as well to show some compassion. And not all people show
Yeah.
compassion, but anyhow, so it's a sort of a very fluid, watery situation.
Yeah, I really resonate with everything that you've just said, especially in the opportunity for learning about yourself and about the other person. Why is their reaction having the effect that it has on me, right? So no one else can make me feel a particular way, right? I have to interpret
Mm,
their response as being meaningful, and that I have to attach meaning to it.
mm,
And I think that that's great, in that we can learn about our ourselves through this experience.
mm.
Yeah.
Uh, to Jesse, before we end, and do you want to share a little bit about the good work that the Stuttering Scholarship Alliance is doing? Because you're also a board member, so do you want to give them a shout out?
I would love to. It's an organization that I'm so proud to play some small role in. So the Stuttering Scholarship Alliance is I think it's an amazing organization that was created by Nathan Malapetty when he was a student here at UCLA. And he had this sort of really inspired idea of bridging costs and access to people who stutter. And it started off as being geared towards people who stutter in Southern California. And he did such a great job at it that it's sort of taken on this international scale. Um, and so the mission of SSA is to increase access to high quality, client centered speech therapy for people who stutter, especially in underrepresented and underserved communities by reducing the financial barriers to service. And so the speech therapy that we will support tends to be acceptance based in orientation. So to kind of go back to the fluency notion that we talked about, it's, SLPs who are willing to kind of rethink fluency targets, um, and it provides a short-term structure that's intended to provide a catalyst for self-directed change. And I would think what's great about it is that it helps people to reimagine their relationship with speech and promote self-advocacy, acceptance, pride, and resilience. And so, what the organization does is that it addresses a number of different problems in getting access to good care. So, speech therapy is expensive. It can be prohibitively expensive for many of us. It's often inaccessible. It can be inaccessible based on location. It can also be hard to find a person who is specialized in stuttering. So SLPs often don't get more than a single class on stuttering. And our experience of the organization is that untrained speech therapy methods can be ineffective or even harmful by introducing these targets that kind of reinforce the negative effects of the stuttering experience by sort of contributing to a sense of deficiency and alienation. And so what we do is there are actually a lot of different aspects to the organization, but I think one of the main things that we do is try to provide reduce access to care, sometimes reducing it by an average of around 10 times. So that we'll be able to subsidize a number of sessions either entirely or in kind of the majority of the of the cost. And we partner with really amazing SLPs, some of whom are people who stutter, but are in general those who understand the experience, who have taken the time to really um, show that they're advocates for people who stutter. And then there are kind of a series of check-ins. We want to make sure that the relationship is going well. And so we
Mm.
have a board that's or a committee who assesses um, all of this as well. But beyond sort of providing kind of financial services to again reduce the barriers to care, we do a number of other things. So there's a training of future SLPs. So we're not just sort of looking at what the problem is now. We're looking at how we might correct it in the future. And these are amazing people. So we've got a bunch of volunteers who want to understand the lives of people who stutter and to know how to function as advocates more. And so we provide, financial and educational support. We have weekly meetings among volunteers, and we pull from people from all over the world. Um, And
Mm.
so that might include discussing articles on stuttering, listening to stories of people who stutter from all walks of life. Um, you know, Greg, I would love to see you at one of those meetings, and
Mm.
telling us more about your experience. And we also have workshops on stuttering education, and this includes um, kind of a larger context of disability rights, and we might present at high schools or in colleges. And then as a way of building community among people who stutter with events, shared resources, and so on. And if it's okay, I'd like to give a few plugs for upcoming events. Um,
Oh, definitely. Go ahead.
so there are two events that I'm really excited about. They're both occurring in April. So April 1st is our, I don't know, third or fourth iteration of the Human Library event for people who stutter. And this is in partnership with the World Stuttering Network and Stanley. And I don't know if you've heard of the Human Library before, but it's a really interesting concept where you sort of treat you know, it's as though you check out a person as though they were a book, and you get to have a conversation with them about their experience. It's a really like kind of
Interesting.
open, vulnerable, uh, informative conversation. And so I think this was developed not for people who stutter per se, but for anyone that comes from a stigmatized group due to lifestyle diagnosis, creed, disability, ethnic origin, and so on. Yeah, we've had really amazing conversations. And so, April 1st, there'll be two sessions over Zoom. It's free to register. So, one is at noon Eastern, and the other is at 8 p.m. Eastern, and that's designed to get people from all over, and that's been really really great. Um,
Mm.
so that's the Human Library for people who stutter. The other one that I'm really excited about is we're doing National Poetry Month for people who stutter, and the idea, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, is that um, it seems that poetry occupies a particularly important place in the lives of many people who stutter. I know that when I was in college, I used to read the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock, every other day, just as a way of sort of practicing my speech. But it also kind of engaged me with language, which can feel like something that can be inaccessible at at times. So the National Poetry Month for people who stutter is in the entire month of April, um, and it's an opportunity for people who stutter, advocates, allies, family members, anyone really, to celebrate poems about stuttering, to celebrate people, uh, poets who stutter, and will feature, hopefully, people who stutter reading poetry in various social media platforms. And this has sort of two functions. One is to reclaim a bit of space that I feel is often denied to people who stutter. And
Mm.
we're hoping that it also will help raise awareness and serve as a bit of advocacy for
Mm.
stuttering itself and for the organization.
Mm. Jesse, if if we have listeners now that would like to take advantage about these opportunities, where would they go
Yeah, so
to
you want to go to the Stuttering Scholarship Alliance website.
okay,
And so on our events
okay,
page, we have um, uh, links and registration. Um,
okay,
and
okay.
we will be uh, um, posting there as well our handles to poetry readings on social media.
Mm.
as well. So I think the SSA website would be the place to go. And I will just add one last plug, if that's okay, just to say that, you know, it's a Big Tent organization. And if you're a person who stutters, who wants to become involved, if you're interested in SLP in various points of your career, if you're a parent of a person who stutters, or you have a loved one, we really welcome people to become involved. So
Wonderful,
reach out, and
wonderful.
we'll find a great
Um,
place for you.
Jesse, would you email me these links and I'll send it out for you? Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. That would be great.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jesse, for your time. This this has been been a very informative in interview. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just will say that I love this podcast. I listen to it, and I think it does such an amazing job at bringing people who stutter into um, um, you know, giving roles for people who stutter a way to talk about it, which I think is something that is just hasn't been done as much as it should be. And so I just thank long story short, thank you for this podcast. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, yeah, and thank you for listening to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we will have you back again for sure.
That would be wonderful. All right. Thank you so much.
Take care, Jesse. Bye.
Bye.
Some Stutterla is hosted by Greg O'Grady. It is produced, recorded, and edited by Paul DeDecker, as well as Luca Dini, who, by the way, wrote this jazzy theme music. Leah Bugden and Alicia Megason command our pages on Instagram and TikTok. You can listen to or subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and Spotify. Video versions of each episode are found on our YouTube page. Some Stutterla is a production of the Communication Collaborative.